Before you make a decision you cannot take back. Ethan Brooks said quietly. There is one phone call I need to make. Nobody in the conference room looked concerned. In fact, a few people exchanged amused smiles as though the middle-aged systems engineer had finally accepted the inevitable. To them, it sounded like the desperate request of a man who had just watched 14 years disappear in a single morning. They had no idea that 20 minutes could be long enough to change the future of an entire company. The executive conference room on the 22nd floor of Hawthorne Digital Solutions overlooked downtown Denver beneath a crisp October sky. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected rows of polished glass buildings while the morning sun stretched across the walnut conference table. Fresh coffee filled the room with its rich aroma, blending with the faint scent of leather chairs and expensive cologne. Everything about the room suggested confidence, authority, and control. Ethan sat quietly at the far end of the table, wearing the same navy button-down shirt he had ironed before sunrise while his 9-year-old daughter, Sophie, finished her homework at the kitchen table. He had packed her lunch, braided her hair the best he could, and promised he would be home in time to help her build the solar system model that was due the following Friday. It had started like every other Tuesday, until his calendar invitation simply read, Executive Review Meeting. Claire Morgan, the company's director of human resources, sat across from him with a neatly organized folder resting in front of her. She looked composed, professional, and unusually quiet. Beside her sat the recently appointed chief executive officer, Richard Lawson, a man determined to reshape the company in record time. His reputation had spread quickly through every department. Fast decisions, aggressive restructuring, no room for sentiment. He folded his hands together and looked directly at Ethan. Thank you for coming on short notice. Ethan nodded politely. Of course. Richard slid a document across the table. After reviewing operational efficiency and departmental restructuring, we have decided to eliminate your position effective immediately. The words landed with clinical precision. No raised voices. No argument. Just a carefully rehearsed announcement delivered without hesitation. Claire lowered her eyes briefly as though she wished the conversation had unfolded differently. Ethan looked at the document without reaching for it. He remained still for several seconds while the quiet hum of the building's ventilation system filled the silence. Outside, sunlight reflected off neighboring skyscrapers. Inside, the ticking wall clock suddenly seemed louder than anyone remembered. Richard leaned back confidently. Security will assist you with collecting your personal belongings. Ethan finally spoke. May I ask one question? Richard gestured casually. Go ahead. Ethan's voice remained calm. Was this decision based on a complete review of my responsibilities? Richard answered without hesitation. Your responsibilities have been evaluated. Ethan studied his expression for only a moment before nodding once. I understand. No anger. No pleading. No attempt to defend himself. Claire seemed almost surprised by his composure. She had expected disappointment, perhaps frustration, but not quiet acceptance. Ethan carefully removed the employee identification badge from around his neck and placed it gently on the polished table beside the folder. Then he reached into his worn leather briefcase and took out a framed photograph of Sophie smiling beneath the bright lights of her elementary school science fair. He looked at the picture for a brief moment before placing it carefully back into the bag. Finally, he stood. If there are no further questions, Richard said confidently, this meeting is concluded. Ethan adjusted the strap of his briefcase over his shoulder and offered the smallest respectful nod. Thank you for the opportunity to serve this company. He turned toward the conference room door before pausing with one hand resting lightly on the handle. Without looking back, he spoke one final sentence. I would appreciate 5 minutes to make a phone call. Richard smiled faintly. Be my guest. Ethan walked out into the quiet hallway, closed the door behind him without making a sound, and reached into his pocket for his phone. While inside the conference room, no one noticed that the confidence they felt at that moment had only 20 minutes left to live. Ethan stepped into the quiet hallway and let the conference room door close gently behind him. The soft click echoed through the executive floor before disappearing beneath the distant hum of printers, elevators, and climate control vents. Employees continued walking between offices carrying laptops and coffee cups, unaware that 14 years of faithful service had just been reduced to a single folder on a polished conference table. Ethan looked down at the phone resting in his hand, but did not dial immediately. Instead, he walked toward the large windows overlooking downtown Denver. Morning traffic flowed steadily below, tiny streams of headlights weaving through streets that had witnessed thousands of people beginning another ordinary workday. He took one slow breath, then another. Anger would have been easy. Bitterness would have been understandable. But neither of those emotions had ever helped him become the father Sophie deserved. 14 years earlier, Ethan had joined Hawthorne Digital Solutions when the company occupied only 2 floors in a much older building across town. Back then, there had been fewer than 60 employees, folding tables instead of executive offices, and long evenings spent solving problems with pizza boxes stacked beside humming servers. He had helped design security systems that protected hospitals, transportation networks, and public infrastructure across several states. While executives came and went, Ethan quietly remained. He never cared much about titles. He cared about doing the work correctly. His coworkers often joked that if something stopped working at 2 o'clock in the morning, Ethan would already be fixing it before anyone else realized there was a problem. He accepted that reputation with a smile, then returned home every evening to help Sophie with spelling words, science projects, and bedtime stories. Since losing his wife, Emily, 5 years earlier after a sudden illness, every important decision in his life had begun with the same question. Would this help his daughter grow into a kind and honorable person? That question shaped everything from the jobs he accepted to the words he chose when life became unfair. Sophie had never seen her father speak with bitterness about anyone. Whenever she asked why some people treated others unfairly, Ethan always answered the same way. We cannot choose what happens to us, sweetheart. We can only choose who we become because of it. Those words returned to him now as he unlocked his phone. He finally selected one familiar contact and pressed the call button. The line connected almost immediately. "Good morning," a calm voice answered. "This is Ethan Brooks," he said evenly. "I need to report a compliance event that requires immediate review under our standing agreement." There was a brief pause before the voice became noticeably more serious. "Are you making this notification in your official capacity?" Ethan looked back through the glass wall toward the conference room where executives continued discussing schedules, budgets, and restructuring plans. "Yes," he replied. "I believe federal compliance procedures have been bypassed, and I have a legal obligation to report it." "Understood," the voice answered. "Please remain available. We are activating the review process immediately." The call ended after less than 30 seconds. Ethan slipped the phone back into his pocket as calmly as he had removed it. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. He simply picked up the cardboard box waiting beside the reception desk and began placing inside it the few personal belongings from his office. A coffee mug Sophie had painted with uneven blue stars, a framed family photograph from a camping trip in Rocky Mountain National Park, and a worn notebook filled with handwritten reminders. The receptionist watched quietly, her expression filled with sympathy. "I am so sorry, Ethan," she whispered. He smiled kindly. "Thank you. Please do not worry. Sometimes the right thing is simply the harder thing." Then he lifted the box, walked toward the elevators, and disappeared from the executive floor with the same quiet dignity that had defined every one of his 14 years inside the building. The elevator doors opened quietly onto the lobby, and Ethan stepped out carrying the small cardboard box that held everything 14 years had left behind. A security officer standing near the reception desk gave him a sympathetic nod, but said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Ethan signed the visitor exit log, placed his employee badge beside the clipboard, and thanked the receptionist for all the mornings she had greeted him with a smile before walking through the revolving doors into the cool October air. The city moved around him without slowing down. Office workers hurried toward nearby cafes. Buses released streams of commuters onto crowded sidewalks, and the distant sound of construction echoed between glass towers. Life continued exactly as it always had. Ethan set the box carefully on a stone bench outside the building and checked his watch. 7 minutes had passed since the phone call. He was in no hurry. Back upstairs, however, the atmosphere inside the executive conference room had begun to shift. Richard Lawson stood before a presentation screen explaining the next phase of organizational restructuring while department managers reviewed spreadsheets filled with projected savings and staffing charts. Claire Morgan listened quietly, but her thoughts remained fixed on Ethan's final question. Was this decision based on a complete review of my responsibilities? The sentence replayed in her mind with surprising persistence. She opened the personnel file once more, scanning every page with greater attention than she had before. Something immediately felt incomplete. The employment summary described Ethan as a senior systems engineer, but several sections referenced restricted responsibilities that were not attached to the file. She frowned and turned another page. The authorization history ended almost 2 years earlier, even though Ethan's performance reviews continued through the current year. Richard, Claire interrupted carefully. Where are the compliance assignment records? Richard barely looked up from the presentation. Human resources only needed the restructuring summary. That is not what I asked, Claire replied. His file references responsibilities that are not included. Richard closed his laptop with mild impatience. Claire, he was an engineer. We eliminated the position. We have already moved on. She remained unconvinced. Ethan had never defended himself, never argued, never even questioned the financial reasoning behind the decision. Instead, he had asked one precise question about responsibilities. That was not the reaction of someone trying to save a paycheck. It was the reaction of someone confirming a fact. Claire quietly opened the company's internal compliance database and entered Ethan's employee identification number. The system paused for several seconds before displaying a message she had never seen before. Access restricted. Executive compliance authorization required. She tried again using a higher authorization level. The same message appeared. A faint uneasiness settled over the room that only she seemed to notice. Down on the sidewalk, Ethan removed Sophie's painted coffee mug from the box and smiled at the uneven blue stars circling the ceramic surface. She had proudly given it to him on Father's Day with a handwritten note taped to the handle that read, "My dad fixes computers and hearts." He gently wrapped the mug inside an old sweater before placing it back into the box. His phone vibrated once. A single message appeared on the screen. Review team confirmed. Estimated arrival, 12 minutes. Ethan locked the phone without responding. He was not waiting for revenge. He was waiting for the process to do exactly what it had been designed to do. Above him, sunlight reflected across the mirrored windows of Hawthorne Digital Solutions. While inside those same windows, Claire stared at her computer screen with growing concern, slowly realizing that the man they believed they understood might have been carrying responsibilities far greater than anyone in that conference room had ever bothered to discover. Claire pushed her chair back from the conference table and stood without realizing she had done so. The uneasiness she had been trying to ignore was now impossible to dismiss. She picked up Ethan's personnel folder again, comparing it with the restricted database screen still glowing on her laptop. The dates did not match. The responsibilities did not match. Most importantly, the authority assigned to his employee identification number clearly extended far beyond the position listed on the restructuring report. Richard, she said more firmly this time, who approved removing him before compliance signed off. Richard barely glanced in her direction. The restructuring committee approved every recommendation yesterday afternoon. Claire did not sit back down. That is not what I asked. The room grew noticeably quieter. Several department managers exchanged uncertain glances while the projector continued displaying financial forecasts no one was reading anymore. Richard folded his arms. Claire, this conversation is over. She shook her head slowly. I do not believe it is. At that same moment, Ethan remained outside the building, seated calmly on the stone bench with the cardboard box resting beside him. The autumn breeze carried scattered golden leaves across the plaza, while people hurried past without recognizing the man who had quietly protected systems they relied on every single day. He watched a father across the street kneel to zip his little son's backpack before walking him toward school. The simple moment brought a gentle smile to Ethan's face. He checked the time again. 15 minutes had passed. His phone remained silent because there was nothing else he needed to do. He had fulfilled the obligation entrusted to him years earlier. Whatever happened next belonged to the review process, not to him. Inside Hawthorne Digital Solutions, Claire searched deeper through archived authorization records. A confidential notation finally appeared after an additional security request was approved. Her expression changed immediately. Ethan Brooks had not merely maintained secure infrastructure. He had served as the company's designated compliance liaison for federally regulated security systems under a standing oversight agreement established years before Richard Lawson joined the organization. Company policy required that any action affecting that role be reviewed through multiple independent channels before implementation. Claire felt her heartbeat quicken. She looked directly at Richard. Did anyone notify the oversight office before terminating Ethan? Richard's confidence faded for the first time that morning. That responsibility belongs to legal. Claire answered quietly. Only after compliance completes its review. Before either of them could continue, the conference room door opened. The executive assistant stepped inside, looking unusually tense. Sir, she said carefully, there are several visitors requesting immediate access to the executive floor. Richard frowned. Who are they? They identified themselves as members of corporate compliance, internal audit, and outside legal counsel. The room fell completely silent. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the steady clicking of keyboards outside seemed to disappear beneath the unexpected weight of those words. Claire slowly closed Ethan's personnel file. She finally understood why he had never argued, never pleaded, and never tried to defend himself. He had trusted the truth to speak louder than emotion. Down on the sidewalk, a line of black sport utility vehicles turned quietly into the circular entrance beneath the company's glass tower. They parked one behind another with practiced precision. Men and women carrying slim briefcases stepped out calmly, displaying identification badges before entering the lobby together. Ethan watched them only long enough to confirm their arrival. Then he stood, lifted the cardboard box containing his daughter's painted coffee mug and family photograph, and began walking toward the parking garage. Behind him, the glass doors opened as the review team entered the building, while ahead of him waited the far more important appointment of picking Sophie up after school exactly as he had promised. The elevators opened with a soft chime, and the visitors stepped onto the executive floor without urgency or hesitation. There were no raised voices, no dramatic entrance, only the quiet confidence of people who had done this many times before. 3 men and 2 women walked together carrying slim leather portfolios instead of laptops, each wearing simple identification badges that displayed corporate compliance, internal audit, and independent legal review. Their polished shoes echoed gently across the hardwood floor as employees instinctively moved aside to let them pass. Conversations faded. Coffee cups paused halfway to waiting hands. Even those who did not recognize the visitors immediately understood that something significant had changed. Claire stood near the conference room door, her attention fixed on the group approaching. The woman leading them offered a professional smile before extending a hand. Good morning. I am Rebecca Sloan, Senior Director of Corporate Compliance. Claire returned the handshake. Claire Morgan, Director of Human Resources. Rebecca nodded politely. Thank you. We need immediate access to the executive conference room and all documentation related to this morning's employment action involving Ethan Brooks. Richard Lawson stepped forward with practiced confidence. I am Richard Lawson, Chief Executive Officer. There must be some misunderstanding. Rebecca met his eyes calmly. That is exactly what we are here to determine. No one spoke after that. The review team entered the conference room while an internal auditor quietly requested access to personnel records, authorization logs, and executive approval documents. Another member connected a secure laptop to the conference room display, carefully reviewing timestamps that had been automatically recorded across multiple internal systems. Nothing about their work felt rushed. Every movement reflected discipline, procedure, and respect for the facts. Claire watched in silence as the timeline slowly appeared across the large screen. Ethan's termination authorization had been entered before mandatory compliance verification had even been requested. A required oversight notification had never been submitted. 2 approval fields remained blank. Rebecca looked toward Richard. Can you explain why this employment action proceeded before completion of the federally required review sequence? Richard shifted uncomfortably. We believe those responsibilities had already been reassigned. Rebecca answered with quiet precision. Belief is not documentation. The room fell silent again. Outside the building, Ethan had already reached the parking garage. He carefully placed the cardboard box inside the passenger seat of his aging silver pickup truck before resting both hands on the steering wheel for a brief moment. His phone vibrated softly. Another message appeared. Review initiated. No further action required from you at this time. Thank you for fulfilling your reporting obligation. Ethan read the message once before placing the phone face down beside the coffee mug Sophie had painted years earlier. He closed his eyes briefly, not in relief, but in gratitude. He had never wanted anyone to lose a career. He had only wanted the truth to receive the same respect every employee deserved. Back upstairs, Rebecca Sloan quietly closed the personnel file and addressed everyone seated around the table. Effective immediately, this restructuring decision is suspended pending completion of our investigation. She paused before continuing. Until that investigation is complete, all individuals directly responsible for authorizing or executing this action are relieved of decision-making authority. No one argued. No one reached for an explanation. The confidence that had filled the conference room less than half an hour earlier had disappeared completely, replaced by the unmistakable weight of accountability. Claire lowered her eyes as the reality settled over the room. Ethan had never made a powerful phone call because he knew powerful people. He had made a lawful phone call because he honored responsibilities that others had failed to understand. And in the quiet space between integrity and arrogance, the truth had finally arrived exactly on time. The conference room remained almost perfectly still after Rebecca Sloan's announcement. No one reached for a coffee cup. No one checked a phone. The financial projections still glowed on the large presentation screen, but they no longer seemed important. What mattered now was a different set of numbers, dates, authorization codes, compliance records, and digital signatures quietly appearing across the secure audit display. Rebecca turned another page inside the investigation file before looking toward Claire Morgan. Ms. Morgan, according to these records, Mr. Brooks accepted an additional compliance assignment 6 years ago under a federally regulated security oversight agreement. Were you aware of that responsibility? Claire answered honestly. No. His personnel file did not include those records. Rebecca nodded once. That omission is one of the matters we are now reviewing. Richard Lawson shifted uneasily in his chair. He was still an employee under my authority. Rebecca remained calm. Operationally, yes. Compliance authority follows a separate governance structure established by both company policy and federal contractual obligations. Those responsibilities cannot be removed through a standard restructuring process. Richard looked genuinely confused for the first time that morning. Then why did he never mention any of this? Rebecca closed the folder gently. Because confidentiality was part of the responsibility. Employees trusted with that level of oversight are expected to protect the process, not themselves. Those words settled over the room with unexpected weight. Claire lowered her eyes as memories returned one after another. Ethan had never used his position to gain influence. He had never reminded people how important his work was. He had never corrected coworkers who underestimated him. When servers failed late at night, he simply stayed until everything worked again. When younger engineers struggled, he quietly helped them without asking for recognition. Even his annual performance reviews contained almost identical comments year after year. Dependable, ethical, humble, trusted. Somehow everyone had read those words without truly understanding them. Across town, Ethan drove slowly toward Jefferson Elementary School. The heater hummed softly inside his aging pickup, while afternoon sunlight reflected across the windshield. His cardboard box rested on the passenger seat beside Sophie's painted coffee mug and the framed family photograph. As he waited at a red light, he glanced toward the picture. Emily's smile looked exactly as he remembered it, warm, patient, and full of quiet encouragement. There had been countless evenings after her passing when he questioned whether he was raising Sophie well enough by himself. On difficult days, he imagined what Emily would have said. She never believed success was measured by promotions or titles. She believed it was measured by whether a person could still look in the mirror with peace. Ethan smiled gently. Whatever happened next with Hawthorne Digital Solutions, he had not compromised that peace. Back inside the conference room, the investigation continued. Rebecca projected another document onto the screen. It displayed Ethan's signed compliance agreement, dated 6 years earlier, followed by annual certifications completed without a single missed deadline. Mr. Brooks fulfilled every reporting obligation assigned to him, she explained, including the notification submitted this morning immediately after his employment action. Claire looked up. So that phone call was not retaliation. Rebecca answered without hesitation. No, it was mandatory. Had he failed to make that report, he could have violated the very agreement he spent years honoring. Silence filled the room once again. Richard slowly leaned back in his chair, finally understanding what had happened. Ethan had not defeated anyone. He had simply remained faithful to his responsibilities while everyone else assumed authority could replace procedure. In that quiet realization, the difference between power and integrity became impossible for anyone in the room to ignore. By late afternoon, the atmosphere inside Hawthorne Digital Solutions had changed completely. The confident rhythm of meetings and quarterly planning had given way to quiet conversations behind closed doors, careful document reviews, and respectful silence in the hallways. Employees who had spent the morning worrying about budgets now found themselves watching compliance officers move methodically from office to office, requesting records instead of opinions. There were no dramatic confrontations, no angry accusations, only patient professionals following procedures that had existed long before anyone currently sitting in the executive offices had arrived. Claire Morgan remained in the conference room long after most department managers had been asked to leave. She watched as internal audit reconstructed every step leading to Ethan's dismissal. Email timestamps appeared on the screen beside policy manuals, approval chains, and system access logs. Each document confirmed the same uncomfortable truth. The restructuring had moved faster than the safeguards designed to protect both employees and the company itself. Rebecca Sloan finally closed another file and spoke with the same measured tone she had maintained all day. The investigation has determined that required compliance verification was bypassed before Mr. Brooks' employment action was executed. Responsibility for that failure rests with executive decision-makers, not with Mr. Brooks. No one challenged the conclusion. Richard Lawson stared quietly at the polished conference table where Ethan's employee badge had rested only hours earlier. For the first time since becoming chief executive officer, he realized how little he had actually learned about the people whose names appeared on organizational charts. He had measured positions, salaries, and efficiencies, but he had failed to understand trust, institutional knowledge, and responsibilities that could not be summarized inside a spreadsheet. Rebecca continued reviewing the official findings. Pending completion of the full investigation, Mr. Lawson is relieved of executive authority, effective immediately. Additional administrative actions involving members of the restructuring committee will also take effect today. The words were spoken calmly, without satisfaction or condemnation. They sounded less like punishment and more like the natural consequence of ignoring procedures designed to protect everyone equally. Claire lowered her head as the announcement settled over the room. She had signed the paperwork, believing she was carrying out a routine organizational decision. She now understood that she had trusted incomplete information instead of asking one more necessary question. Across town, the final school bell rang as children poured through the front doors of Jefferson Elementary, carrying backpacks nearly as large as themselves. Ethan parked beside the curb exactly where Sophie expected him every afternoon. She spotted the familiar silver pickup immediately and ran toward it with a bright smile. "Daddy," she called happily as she climbed inside. "You are early today." Ethan smiled back. "Looks like I am." Sophie fastened her seat belt before pulling a model of the solar system from her backpack. "Mrs. Reynolds said we can add extra planets if we want to be creative." Ethan laughed softly. "I think the scientists might have a few questions about that." She giggled, then noticed the cardboard box resting on the passenger seat behind them. "Did you clean your office?" she asked innocently. Ethan glanced at the box before starting the engine. "Something like that." Sophie accepted the answer without another question. She had learned that her father always told the truth, even when he needed time to explain it. As they drove home beneath rows of golden cottonwood trees, Ethan listened while Sophie described her spelling test, her science class, and the stray kitten that had wandered onto the playground during recess. For him, those simple conversations mattered far more than anything happening inside the glass tower downtown. Meanwhile, back at Hawthorne Digital Solutions, executives slowly came to understand a lesson that could never be taught in a boardroom presentation. Authority could sign documents, restructure departments, and remove titles, but only integrity earned the kind of trust that remained standing when every other source of power quietly disappeared. 3 days later, the formal investigation reached its conclusion. Morning sunlight poured through the tall windows of Hawthorne Digital Solutions, illuminating conference rooms that felt noticeably quieter than they had only a week before. Employees spoke in lower voices, not because anyone had ordered them to, but because they had witnessed how quickly confidence could become humility when truth finally entered the room. Claire Morgan stood outside the executive boardroom, holding a thin folder that contained the final findings. She had read every page twice, yet each sentence carried the same lesson. Procedures had been ignored. Critical responsibilities had been overlooked. A good man's integrity had been mistaken for ordinary routine simply because he had never asked for recognition. Rebecca Sloan welcomed Claire into the meeting with a gentle nod. "The review is complete," she said. "Corrective actions have been approved, and official notifications have been issued." Claire looked down at the folder before asking the question that had weighed on her heart since the investigation began. "Has Mr. Brooks been informed?" Rebecca smiled faintly. "Not yet. We wanted the findings finalized before contacting him." Claire hesitated. "May I speak with him personally?" Rebecca studied her for a brief moment before answering. "Yes, I believe that would be appropriate." Across town, Ethan was sitting on the front porch of his modest home while Sophie carefully painted planets for her science project. The late afternoon breeze carried the scent of pine from the nearby foothills, and colorful leaves drifted slowly across the quiet neighborhood street. Sophie held up a blue foam ball with a proud smile. "Does Earth look round enough?" Ethan laughed softly. I think Earth has been doing a pretty good job of looking round for a long time. Sophie giggled before returning to her paintbrush. At that moment, Ethan's phone rang. The caller identification displayed Claire Morgan. He answered calmly. Hello. Claire took a slow breath before speaking. Mr. Brooks, this is Claire. Good afternoon, Ms. Morgan. There was no bitterness in his voice, only simple courtesy. That alone made Claire's apology even more difficult. Ethan, she said quietly, I owe you something much more important than a phone call. He remained silent, allowing her to continue. The investigation confirmed that your employment action should never have happened. I signed documents I should have questioned. I trusted assumptions instead of facts. I am deeply sorry. Ethan looked toward Sophie as she concentrated on painting tiny white clouds across the blue sphere. Thank you for saying that, he replied gently. Claire's voice trembled slightly. The company would like to restore your position immediately, along with full compensation and every benefit you lost. Ethan did not answer right away. The silence stretched for several peaceful seconds while birds settled into the maple tree beside the porch. Finally he spoke. I appreciate the offer. Claire waited hopefully. But Ethan smiled quietly, though she could not see it through the phone. My daughter asked me something the afternoon I came home with that cardboard box. Claire listened carefully. She asked if losing a job meant losing who I was. I told her no. I told her that character stays with you even when a title does not. Claire closed her eyes. I understand. Ethan continued with the same calm voice that had never changed from the beginning of this story. Please tell everyone that I hold no resentment. I truly hope the company becomes stronger because of what happened. But I think my next chapter belongs somewhere else. Tears gathered in Claire's eyes as she whispered, Thank you for giving us more grace than we deserved. Ethan looked once more at Sophie smiling proudly beside her completed solar system. Grace is easiest to give, he answered softly, when you remember someone gave it to you first. When the call ended, neither of them felt like they had won an argument. Instead, they had both discovered something far more lasting. Respect had finally replaced regret, and forgiveness had quietly accomplished what pride never could. 1 year later, a modest brick office overlooking a quiet neighborhood park carried a simple sign beside its front door. Brooks Security Consulting. There were no polished executive floors, no oversized boardrooms, and no reserved parking spaces. Only a welcoming reception area, filled with natural light, sturdy wooden furniture, and framed photographs of community projects completed across Colorado. Ethan had built the company one client at a time, choosing organizations that valued integrity as much as technical expertise. His reputation had traveled farther than he ever expected, not because people remembered the investigation, but because they remembered the way he had conducted himself when everything seemed to be slipping away. Inside his office, the painted coffee mug Sophie had made years earlier still rested beside his computer monitor. The blue stars remained uneven, and the handle had a tiny crack that Ethan refused to repair because it reminded him that imperfect things could still serve faithfully every single day. Sophie, now 1 year older, sat at a small desk in the corner finishing another science assignment while waiting for her father to leave work. She looked up with a bright smile. Daddy, did the new community hospital sign the agreement? Ethan nodded. They did. Sophie grinned proudly. I knew they would. He laughed softly. Your confidence is becoming contagious. A gentle knock sounded at the office door. Ethan opened it to find Claire Morgan standing outside, holding a small gift bag and wearing the relaxed expression of someone who no longer carried the weight of unfinished apologies. I hope I am not interrupting, she said. Not at all, Ethan replied warmly. Sophie hurried over and greeted Claire with the easy friendliness children often extend without hesitation. Claire handed Ethan the gift bag. Inside rested the employee identification badge he had placed on the conference table 1 year earlier, now mounted inside a simple wooden frame beneath a brass plate engraved with a single sentence. Integrity outlasts every title. Ethan remained quiet for several moments before smiling gratefully. This is thoughtful. Claire nodded. The board wanted you to know that your example changed more than one investigation. She explained that Hawthorne Digital Solutions had rewritten its leadership training, strengthened every compliance safeguard, and introduced a company value now displayed in every office across the organization. Respect people before positions. New employees learned Ethan's story without his name ever becoming a headline. The lesson focused instead on humility, accountability, and the importance of asking one more honest question before making decisions that affected another person's life. Ethan looked through the office window toward the park where autumn leaves drifted gently across the walking paths. I am glad something good came from it, he said quietly. Claire smiled. More than something good. She looked towards Sophie, who was carefully organizing colored pencils beside her homework. Your father reminded an entire company that leadership begins with character. After Claire left, Sophie studied the framed employee badge resting on her father's desk. Are you glad you did not go back? She asked. Ethan looked around the office they had built together, then toward the evening sunlight filling the room with a warm golden glow. Very glad, he answered. Because sometimes losing the place where you work helps you discover the place where you belong. Sophie slipped her small hand into his as they locked the office for the evening and walked toward the parking lot together. The world had once measured Ethan by a job title that disappeared in a single morning. His daughter measured him by something that could never be taken away. As they drove home beneath a sky painted with the colors of another Colorado sunset, one truth remained brighter than every success that followed. A quiet heart guided by integrity will always leave a stronger legacy than the loudest position ever could.